All right, good morning. This is my 1 year and 3 months, 15 months update learning Latin, I guess. I think that's what the calendar says. And I thought it'd be fun to do a quick update to share where I'm at so far. Here's a lovely portrait of Erasmus, who is an author I read in the last 3 months. We'll talk about him. He always looks very self-satisfied in this portrait, as opposed to the Thomas More portrait that is he looks very stern and very serious. I don't know if that reflects their personalities at all, but all right. And in case you don't know, Erasmus is one of the most famous Renaissance authors of all time. He wrote a collection of dialogues among thousands of letters and essays, among other things. Probably the most widely published and popular authors of his day. Anyways, let's get into it. What have I read in the last 3 months? So in terms of total words I read 1,540,000 words. So 1,541,000 approximately. So I read about 500,000 words in the last 3 months, which I think works out to about 5,000 words a day, maybe slightly less, something like that, which is not great, but it's not bad either. We can't feel too sad if we don't read as much as we want. We just have to celebrate our successes and always try and do better. Obviously, 10,000 words or more is a great goal to have, but you don't always get there. But again, even 5,000 words a day is quite a lot, and you just got to do what you got to do. Okay, so what have I read in the last 3 months? So this is I have two spreadsheets basically. I have my actual spreadsheet of things I read, and then there's my other spreadsheet, which is a little more organized. So they're kind of in parallel. I tried to kind of merge them in a way, but it's hard. So in terms of what I actually read, why don't we go, this is kind of confusing, so why don't we go to the actual spreadsheet, the one that encouraged people to read from, just because it's a little more organized. So one thing you might notice from this list is I sort of reorganized it a little bit. I have stages and I gave them kind of new names. Part of the issue here, of course, is that language learning isn't always in these perfectly well-organized stages, and in reality it's a little more random and messy and chaotic. I would never want anyone to think that they have to go by a certain strict order to read things. Ultimately, language learning is a very messy process, and you have to be flexible, you have to switch things up. Sometimes you might have a plan and you have to change it up. And sometimes things that worked for you at the beginning won't necessarily work for you later. So as an example, if your strategy was to look up every single word, every single grammatical construction, and know exactly what everything is going on for every single sentence, that will work at the beginning, and probably hypothetically could work forever with enough time. But that strategy in particular, whether or not it's a good strategy at all, you can argue about that, but probably the best time for that is at the very, very beginning, as you're just getting a handle on the basic grammar and vocabulary. But it becomes significantly less useful as time goes on, because what you need is more exposure rather than that granularity, in my opinion. And I had experience with that learning French. I did the granular approach for a while. It's funny, I read a book called L'Étranger, which is, I think, The Outsider in English, one of the most famous books in French. And in that book, I looked up every single word, memorized every word I didn't know, looked up every conjugation, all that stuff. But it's funny, I reread it, or at least a few pages from it, this not too long ago. And it was weird. It was almost like reading it for the first time. And I noticed subtlety and nuance to the tone of it and other things, even though my reading of French is certainly not native level and I have a lot more to improve. There was so much I noticed that I didn't get initially. And that's kind of like a lesson I learned, is that even if you do painstakingly go through it word for word, grammatical construction by grammatical construction, you will miss things and you will not be able to get the whole thing. You will not be able to squeeze everything from Julius Caesar going word for word, just because your level is not there to actually squeeze out everything. And so you don't have to worry about getting everything, because you're going to miss things no matter what you do. So kind of letting go and not worrying about missing stuff, I think, is an important thing. But yeah, so like I said before, language learning is a messy process, but I also like spreadsheets and lists, so I reorganize things in a little more interesting way. By the way, sometimes I've heard that when you look at this list, it looks very overwhelming. It's like, oh my gosh, look at all this stuff that you have to read. And from my perspective, that's not like weird. I mean, language learning is about just just the sheer amount of content that you have to read. And it's not odd that you would have to read so much. But for some people who have this kind of vague idea that they read Familia Romana, maybe Roma Aeterna, and then you do a little speaking and writing on Discord, and then maybe a tiny bit of other classical authors or something, then you're fluent. Maybe that's a straw man. I don't know. Maybe that's a caricature. I'm not sure. But I feel like a lot of people, at least beginners who've never learned a language, have that vague idea that that's how it works. That's not at all it, right? Language learning is about an immense amount of input. We need to read millions of words to get there, no matter what strategy you do. I think sometimes people, they're like beginners maybe who look at this spreadsheet and get kind of like, their eyes go wide because they're like, oh my gosh, how much I have to read. It's like kind of looking at Mount Everest, I guess, and not knowing and not even wondering if you should even start. I'm not sure I have a good solution to that because that's just the nature of language learning. You need to read a lot. But again, you don't read it all in one go. You just go step by step by step, read a little bit every day, read a few thousand words a day, and you'll get through this list in a reasonable amount of time. Maybe the idea is that because people have this idea that you have to do the granular approach of looking up every construction, every word. Yeah, it would take you a million years to go through this list in that approach. But again, that's not the reason you do extensive reading, right? When you do reading in this way, you don't have to worry about everything. And oftentimes you might not know why a sentence means something. And you might not even know why it grammatically makes sense, but your brain just intuitively understands it. And that's where you want to get. And you don't have to have a conscious understanding of the grammar in order to understand what the message is being communicating. Now, that can be helpful. I'm not against grammar study at all in any way. Grammar study and conscious knowledge is very different from acquisition. You can I'm 100% confident you could not understand Latin grammar very much at all, but hypothetically get to a stage where you can read at a near native level, let's say anything but any Renaissance writer, most classical stuff, etc. I 100% believe you could have very little conscious understanding of Latin grammar, less than me, and I don't even know that much, but still have a extremely high understanding. And that makes sense because plenty of people have, native speakers. There'll be native speakers who have an extremely high level ability in the language, in an extremely complex language, and have never done formal study. The vast majority of languages that have ever existed didn't have a writing system, and the vast majority of people never went to grammar school or anything like that. So, of course, it's possible to learn a language without actually consciously understanding the grammar. The goal, though, of course, is to get to that point, and grammar can be useful for that purpose, blah, blah, blah. And people have to decide how much they want to study. It's up to them. You certainly don't need it, but it's a part of the package, potentially. Long story short, I organized my spreadsheet in a way that I thought was interesting and fulfilled that part of my brain that likes to organize things. But most of this looks familiar. I'm sure you've seen this before. But I call it for stage 1, Familia Romana and beginner supplements. And then stage 2, Familia Romana and extensive reading. So that's normal like before. Stage 3 is beginner and intermediate readers. Very, very normal. I don't think I changed anything here. And then stage 4, of course, is late medieval Renaissance and Neo-Latin. And again, it's like there's Renaissance Latin that shows up later in this list, so it's kind of arbitrary. But so there's that. And I was thinking about this one selection here at the end, Historia de Duobus Amantibus, which was a Renaissance text. And when I read it, it was pretty hard. I was wondering, maybe this should be moved around. Maybe it should be moved a little bit later. But I did look at it again like yesterday, and I realized, no, it's okay there. Like, it's certainly harder than the stuff on the rest of the list, that's for sure. Or at least I think roughly. It's on average a little bit difficult. But it does have a relatively simple style, I would say. It's not very complex in terms of the density of ideas, even though the amount of vocabulary used is quite varied, especially compared to the previous text, especially if you read a lot of stuff that's just preparing you for Caesar or Nepos or Cicero, for example. It uses a different style of vocabulary, but stylistically probably simpler than stuff you'll actually read most authentic texts, especially classical texts. So it might be a challenge when you get to it, but I think it's probably in a good spot. Of course, all this stuff, it's not perfectly scaled. There's no way to perfectly evaluate the difficulty. I do my best because I'm interested in this process. It's certainly not, you should never take this as set in stone but at the same time, just because a work is hard doesn't mean necessarily that you won't get benefit from it. There's this idea in the Latin learning community that unless you have 99% comprehension, 98% comprehension, 90% comprehension, 80% comprehension, whoever, it depends on who you're talking to. Everyone has a different opinion on it. Unless you have a certain specific high percentage comprehension of something, you can't learn from it. But that's not true. For example, like people have the experience of being thrown into an immersion environment where people are talking in their target language and initially they don't understand very much at all. Comprehension, very low, 10%, 20%. But little by little, they get better and better and they understand everything. In the same way, of course, that would work for reading, right? If anything, it's a little bit easier with reading because we don't have the challenge of oral comprehension, because we don't have to parse the language in real time. We don't have to distinguish the phonemes and all that stuff. Whereas reading, the words are just on the page. We can look up words and grammar if we want, but ultimately it's just kind of there to parse. So yeah, long story short, if you're reading a book that is very hard, even if it feels like you're just spinning your wheels, not really learning anything, you're still learning things, even if it doesn't feel like it. Because you shouldn't judge how much you're learning by how much you're comprehending. I know that's an interesting concept that I don't think people talk about as enough as they should. But you can't judge how much you're learning or how much you're acquiring, I guess, in the Krashen way, how much you're acquiring versus by how much you're comprehending. And I think this is interesting. Sometimes, and this is interesting in relation to dual texts or bilingual texts, because when you use bilingual text, you are understanding at a very high level because you can always just check the English or whatever your native language is. And so your comprehension is high, but are you actually learning more or are you acquiring more as a result of that? And it's actually not even obvious to me that you are learning more or acquiring more. Perhaps, but again, it's not obvious to me. And that the difference might be smaller than we might think. And when I was reading parts of the Bible, I experimented with both processes. Sometimes when I did, I think the Gospels, I'd always check the English. I would read the line. If there was anything I didn't understand, I would check the English and go back and forth. I did that for all 4 Gospels. When I did Genesis and Exodus, I believe I didn't do that. I think I just read it and looked up words as I went. And like I said, it's not obvious to me which one did I learn more from. Because again, just because you get the English translation doesn't mean necessarily that you've acquired the language. I do think there is a relationship between understanding and comprehension and acquisition. What that is, it's a little unclear. So for example, if I open up a book of Chinese, as an example, as someone who does not speak or understand Chinese, I will have a 0% comprehension. And no matter how long I read the book, I will never learn Chinese. I will never. Now, because I have no comprehension whatsoever to start building the comprehension. In a way, I think Steve Kaufman, he has the analogy of sort of a snowball that rolls down a hill. And initially you have a very tiny snowball produced by, say, a textbook or something. And then the more you expose to the language, it gets bigger and bigger. And then as you go along, it just builds faster and faster, almost exponentially. But if you don't have any snow whatsoever, you can't build the snowball. So it must be that if you have no knowledge whatsoever of the language, then it's unlikely that you'll learn anything at all. Although if you listen to it, what if you watch TV in Chinese? I think maybe given enough time, you probably could learn the language. But when you have so little to start with, I think there is limitations there. I think anecdotally and scientifically, I think there's something there. But most of the time, people have some knowledge of the language, a few hundred or a few thousand words, basic grammar and stuff. So in that context, how much does comprehension affect our learning? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I've read really tough books, both in French and English, French and Latin, and learned a lot from the process. I feel like I really learned and improved my understanding of the languages. And then I've read simpler books that I also feel like I improved from. And it's not obvious to me at all from my experience learning languages what is the faster process. It certainly feels more fun to read books that are closer to your level. And I think motivation is probably the biggest thing. It's just hard to stay motivated and be in a good focused mental state on stuff where you have low comprehension. And that's probably the thing. If you have, say you're only understanding bits and pieces of what you're reading, your motivation is going to be low and your mind might wander and stuff like that. And that's probably, and you might have negative feelings about the process and that might slow your acquisition. So that's probably the argument. But hypothetically, if you're highly motivated and interested in the material, can get into kind of a flow state, it's not obvious to me whether comprehension impacts acquisition, assuming you have a base of knowledge from a textbook or vocabulary. Again, I encourage people to experiment and not be freaked out if what you're reading, you don't understand everything. Even if you understand bits and pieces, you are learning. Even something simple like everyone will know the word et, for example, for and. And there's lots of ways to use et in Latin. And I'm not an expert on it by any means, but every time you see that word, the depth of your understanding gets bigger and bigger. And all those simple words and phrases, and little by little with the authors that you're reading, you'll recognize patterns, you'll notice words that they use again and again. And even if it doesn't feel like you're learning, you're 100% are. It's just, you kind of have to take it on a leap of faith. Anyways, after the late medieval Renaissance and Neo-Latin, there's a new stage called Colloquia, or conversations, dialogues, whatever. This is still a work in process because, as you can see, I'm still working through it. Obviously, I'm doing it kind of out of order. A lot of these are pretty famous, a bunch of dialogues that Jessica has linked to discussed in the past that are part of here. Raphael, of course, has talked about these as well. So the idea here is that it's sort of just a different style of Latin, that it's more about conversations. And I think this is a really good stage for people who really are jazzed about spoken Latin, because this is like where you should be learning how to speak, other than obviously listening to people and talking with people. This is all meant to imitate how people idiomatically and naturally talked. And so I actually haven't read this first one. It's one of probably the easiest one. I did peek at it, and it's fairly simple. So I'll be reading that pretty soon. I read Colloquia Latina by Duge a very long time ago. I don't know, months and months ago. And it was very hard for me at the time. But I imagine, and I glanced at it the other day, and it seems like appropriate level here. And it might even be easy, especially compared to some of the harder prose stuff from the previous stage. But it's also just a different domain of language. It's not prose, it's casual conversation. And that's just a very different style language, and you have to get used to it. So it's okay to start a little bit easy and then build, of course. So you might even notice as you start stage 5 that the language is easier than this previous stage, but it'll ramp up, of course. Anyways, I did read Sermones Romani. I recommend just reading pages 4 to 42, because after that, it's just a lot of authentic texts that aren't particularly easy, and it kind of jumps around in terms of difficulty. Sometimes it's a passage from the Vulgate, so relatively accessible, but before that it was, I forget, I don't know, something by Cato or something about agriculture, which is quite hard. So it's not really scaled in terms of difficulty super well. And it's not even that long, but I read through it. It's about 10,000 words or something. You could do it, but in reality, I think you can just read the first 40 pages, and if you want to be really good use of your time, in my opinion. But it's good read. Some of it's based on classic dialogue from, I think, Antiquity, and then there's some Phaedrus fables, and I think selections from a play and stuff, and it's all good stuff, and it's glossed in the Orberg style on the right, on the left, and it's a good time. And then Living Latin, a Graded Reader. This is by the Paideia Institute. Raphael linked it on Reddit a while ago. No one really talks about it. I bought it, and I think it's really good. It was too hard for me when I'm confident this is a good place for it, because it's not that hard. It's relatively simple, especially compared to things like Erasmus or classical antiquity authors. But it talks about everyday topics like internet and TV and grocery shopping and stuff like that. So just really useful for if you want to be in part of the Living Latin community. Just a useful read. And again, not necessarily easy. It's not Familia Romana level or anything like that, but it's very accessible. Let's put it that way. While still you'll learn a lot. And I also was really curious about Asimil. I think that's how it's pronounced, Asimil Latin, which is not available actually in English officially. It's available in French. But the basic idea is you'll have Latin on one side, kind of like a bilingual text. And I think there's these different phases and waves you're supposed to go through, but you can just treat it like a bilingual text that you just read. And it's just a collection of dialogues. There is some authentic text later in, so that might be a little bit of a challenge, but again, there's nothing wrong with a bit of a challenge. And ostensibly, it's supposed to teach you Latin from the very beginning, but I think it's way too hard for a beginner. Just start with Asimil. And so thank goodness for Familia Romana or other texts like that. But once you have a base, I think it's a really good text. I think there's some interesting dialogues, jokes, and funny things. And it was fun to use my French ability a little bit. I do have a link to an English translation of it. So if you don't speak French, don't try to Google translate the French stuff, or if you don't understand French, I think it would be way too painful. to try and do that. So if you don't have a decent level of French, don't try to like Google Translate it. It'll be too hard. But if you want to, you could just read it and then look up words as you go, like you normally might do, or there is an English translation here. I think it's unofficial, but you can take a look at that to help you if you don't speak French super well. All right, now there are other ones that I haven't gone to yet. I think they're a mixture of Renaissance stuff. I think they're all Renaissance authors who wrote these series of dialogues as an idea to teach people how to converse in Latin. They're from various authors about various topics, often about school and about like students and how to interact with your teachers and things like their writing instruments and their ink and stuff. It's actually kind of interesting to read about their kind of school life and about getting money from home and going home to care for their sick mom or going for breakfast and stuff. So it's kind of charming, a lot of these little dialogues. So that it is actually kind of fun. And again, it's a very different style of writing than say reading Caesar with like battles and hostages and stuff like that. And if you've only read the stuff like that, or Livy and stuff, it's nice to read a different style, very somewhat organic. Perhaps it's artificial, I don't know. Anyways, and now the main thing that I read was kind of the highlight was Erasmus's Colloquia. And this is probably one of the most famous colloquia from the Renaissance. He wrote this for students, I guess, or one of the most popular things to read, I think, by Erasmus. He wrote a lot of stuff and obviously super popular. And it was a very interesting experience reading it because the beginning was actually not very hard, I would say. First, maybe 10-20%, actually relatively easy, somewhat similar to other stuff that I read. But after about 25%, it really does ramp up in difficulty. And you'll have these like long conversations, often philosophical debates about a variety of topics or long stories or anecdotes. And it was a very challenge. I'll admit, during the middle, I was a little dispirited. I'm reading this. I barely understood what that chapter was even talking about, any of the, like, even the topic. I was feeling a little discouraged, I'll admit. But I stuck with it, and I did feel like I turned a corner by the end. I'm not sure if some of the later chapters are a little bit easier than the earlier chapters, but it did feel like the quality, the amount of my comprehension started to rise. I wouldn't say I was quite at like what most people would consider extensive reading level, where you can pretty much understand all the main ideas, even though you're missing some details. I don't think I was always quite there, but I did notice a significant difference from the beginning and end. And I did notice my fluency improve a lot. And the things, even though I might not have understood everything, the things that I did understand got better and better and better. And I did start to recognize Erasmus's typical style and typical sentence structure and use of vocabulary that I hadn't seen before. And little by and there were parts, especially near the end of the book, as I got close to the end, where I got into a real flow state and could understand sentence after sentence after sentence. And it depended on the topic. Like the very last chapter is this sort of philosophical discussion that I found kind of hard to follow. I'm sure it's not like a super complicated topic, but I just found it kind of tricky. But I think it was the previous chapter that was talking a little bit about science, and it was talking about, what gives things weight and stuff like that. And because I'm like somewhat familiar with those topics from a layman's perspective, at least, I could actually understand it pretty well. And especially because, their understanding of things is very similar to ours. And so that was pretty cool. I don't know exactly how it's going to shake out in terms of the relative difficulty. I do think it's worth reading, though, at this rough stage, I think, because I would say I made more progress reading that than some of like the harder stuff. Anyways, Historia Regum Britanniae and Historia Francorum were way above my level when I read them. And I don't think I made as much progress, at least consciously or subjectively, compared to Erasmus. And I'm sure that's just because, let's say I was at 20% understanding Historia Francorum. That's just throwing out a number. I don't know what it was. I'm sure it varied from 100% to 0%. But let's just say 20%. And I would say I went from 20% to 25% or something. It's very hard to feel that difference. But my guess is with Erasmus is that I was like at 50 or 60% comprehension, and that started to raise to 70 to 80% as it went on, which you can feel that more. As you get closer to 100%, you notice that. But when you go from like, say, 10% to 20%, you don't feel that at all because you're still basically don't understand what's going on. But if you go from 80% to 90%, that's huge. So that's probably, I'm sure I learned just as much from those texts as I did from Erasmus, but like I said, who knows? Anyways, I did feel honestly like I made solid progress reading it and I got used to it. Again, I would have to read probably double that amount or more to really start getting to the point of 90% plus, I think, understanding Erasmus. Again, I wouldn't say I really liked his style. It's not that his style is particularly dense, it's just different. And he talks about different things with variety of vocabulary that I just haven't seen before, and it would just take me a while for me to get used to the vocabulary that he tends to use because he talks about many different topics. And at one point, I do want to go back and read Erasmus. I do have him on here later under like late medieval Renaissance literature. I have some selections from him and I think an essay that he wrote, or it's like novella, I guess, length. So I am going to read him more later, and he wrote a ton of stuff that we just have access to on Google Books or Internet Archive. He wrote over 2,000 letters or something like that. So millions and millions of words of Erasmus is out there to be read. For some reason, I had this impression that it would be like exactly like Cicero, which is ironic because he wrote an essay saying people should stop trying to slavishly adhere to Cicero. He wrote about how people would refuse to use words or grammatical constructions that Cicero didn't, which is weird because if you're a Christian writer, obviously Cicero didn't write about Christianity, so how do you talk about things in Christianity? Like he would I think they talked about like referring to like Jupiter and stuff like that as a way to talk about God because they refuse to use any stuff like that, some absurdities like that. I haven't actually read the essay yet or anything, but yeah, he wrote a lot of stuff, and so you could spend like probably, I mean, a person could read it all, right? I don't know how much it is. I think I had heard it's a few million words available for Erasmus, 10 million, something like that, maybe. So it's like hypothetically possible you could read all of Erasmus. It's a lot regardless. Like you can, you could spend a long time on it. There's millions of words. You can get very, very good at Latin just from Erasmus alone. But, you know, it's fun to read other authors too. So I do intend to go back and read other Erasmus stuff in the future. It's kind of a delightful style, just kind of light and fun, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to describe, especially because I'm not very good at Latin yet. I enjoyed the experience, even though it was quite tough and I felt very dispirited in the middle. But that's kind of how language learning works, right? Some days you feel like the god of Latin. You're like, oh my god, this is so easy. And then some days you're like, do I even understand anything in this language? And sometimes I'll flip even within the same day or the same reading session, sometimes day by day or week by week. The nice thing about language learning is that if you just keep on doing it, you'll always get better. As long as you keep on exposing yourself to a new language, it's inevitable that you'll get better and better. Anyways, after this section, Colloquia, it shouldn't take me too much longer to read through the rest. Erasmus took me a while, but actually there's quite a bit here. So this may take me another, I think, maybe another month probably to finish all the dialogues, but we'll see. Because I do get the sense, after reading Erasmus, I took a peek at some of these other ones. I'm like, wow, these feel a lot easier after reading so much Erasmus. So there we go. So maybe it did help a little bit. Anyways, after I finish that, so hopefully I'll be able to finish that in a month, I have my Introduction to Classical Latin, which is kind of short, but a lot of these sections are pretty long, a lot of these books. So it looks basically the same as before, I seem to remember. I don't know how much I read previously in terms of like what I changed, but I can quickly go through it. I'm not sure if I read Huginius Fabulae, which is a collection of, they're sort of like summaries, I forget the term, short little summaries of these myths, which is interesting because in some ways it's easier, but on the other hand, because it's so brief, it's so dense in terms of information. If you haven't actually read the myths before, it can actually be kind of tricky to understand what he's even talking about. But if you have read them, it's not too hard to understand. So it's good and bad. This one I actually don't know much about. I think it's a Renaissance text, but I actually don't know. But it's a collection of myths as well. But it seemed about similar level as Huginius, so I threw it in there. But I don't really know much about it yet. I actually don't remember if I talked about the other stuff that I read. Liber Memorialis, which is a book that talks about just facts about the world. It was written for a boy by his teacher in Antiquity. And that was interesting. Some interesting parts, some hard parts, some easy parts, but it was cool. Puer Romanus, which I had actually read part of it before, and the reason I read it before is that there was this list on extensive reading that suggested it as like a bare bones beginner text, which is 100% not true. It starts fairly easy, but then it progresses quite hard, and there's plenty of selections of of either lightly adapted or unadapted authentic text as it goes along. So it's not, I would say, particularly easy, at least for beginners. Good intermediate level, but it's a good introduction to, I think, dipping your toes into classical writers. I think I didn't really change anything in the introduction to classical Latin. I have the same things as before. I would say the only change is I put Roma Aeterna at the end of this section, because I feel like it's probably like I'm waiting too long. Like it's time. After, if I read all of Gallic Wars and all of the Civil War and all of Nepos and stuff and Rufus and things, like I'm ready for Roma Aeterna. Like in what world would I not be? Yes, obviously there's authentic texts and stuff by Cicero and other people and Livy and stuff, but with the support of the notes and stuff, it's probably time. Just we gotta get through the rest of LLPSI. We gotta get through this saga, the Orberg saga. Finally, I think it'd be time. And even if it's too hard, which seems unlikely after reading all this stuff, I think it'll be fine. Anyways, and then I separated stage 7 is late medieval and Renaissance literature. I think it's most of the stuff I had before, but I just put some of the stuff I had read before, which were definitely too hard at the time. Put them in here, just a collection of different things. Again, I'll probably adjust things as I go along, maybe add stuff, maybe take things out. And then stage 8, classical prose. That's how I decided to separate things out. Again, all these stages are arbitrary and you can mix and match and do whatever you want, especially as you get further along. Who cares which order you do things? But I like to make lists. So classical prose is probably the least developed section, but these are like kind of considered, I think, some of the more introductory or easier ones perhaps to target. I put all of Livy here, 500,000 words. Why not? It's just 500,000 words. You can read that in a couple months if you read 10,000 words a day, hypothetically. So why not? So again, I'm sure this will change in the future. And then classical poetry. Again, I don't know anything about classical poetry, what are considered the easier authors, who are considered the easiest authors, but I just put the ones that I've heard of, and we'll go from there. I won't be here for another few months, so I'm not too worried about it. And at the very end, I added some prose composition books. These are the ones recommended by Daniel Pedersen on his website. I don't know if I'll actually do them, because again, writing Latin isn't necessarily like a strong goal I have, although maybe that will change. I would like to eventually write stuff in Latin, like short stories mostly, I would say. I don't have a super strong interest in writing poetry, but writing short stories could be interesting, and also like maybe like translate or adapt stories that I really like. Maybe like adapting like a Shakespeare play might be really cool. Like I had this idea of like Midsummer Night's Dream, but as like a Latin short story, and you can have like 5 chapters for each of the acts and stuff. And that could be pretty cool, but that would be very cool. Anyways, I would like to do some prose composition probably at one point, but who knows? All right. So I think that's basically it. I don't really have much more to say in terms of Latin, because I've already done my rants about language learning and stuff like that. I'm not going to test myself or anything for you today. I don't really feel like it. The plan basically is, again, just keep on doing what I'm doing. I do feel like the plan is working, though. Some days I don't always think that, but I do feel like slowly improving. I look back at things that I read in the past, and it's definitely easier than before. So clearly knowledge of the Latin language is seeping in. And looking just anecdotally at other people who have learned Latin, again, in the more like orthodox way that people online suggest, do all the exercises in Familia Romana and go very slowly and take your time and all that stuff. It's not obvious to me, especially given how much time people put into it. It's not at all obvious to me that my process has been slower than those people. If anything, I almost feel like it's improving faster. Again, it's hard for me to judge that objectively, but my impression, again, just anecdotally from what I've observed and hear people talking about their learning process and how much time they put into it, how long they've been learning for, I don't really see any evidence that my process is actually slower by deliberately not trying to analyze too much and too much grammar study. I don't think there's any evidence that it's slower than the others. If anything, it's faster, or at the very least comparable. It is interesting. Again, I'm not an authority. I'm not great at Latin yet, but I am making steady progress. I am getting better and better. And hopefully in the next 3 months, I will be up to reading Julius Caesar. That'd be really cool. I could probably jump into Caesar right now, but I am interested in reading these dialogues first, and then reading some other stuff, eventually getting to Caesar. Again, I might not be able to get to it because I have other stuff to read, but I'm getting there. All right, that's it.